Hello to 1560 of the Heidegger series. We are experiencing some nice weather today here. Sunshine, and I think it's fitting to continue with John McFarlane and his excerpt, Thomas J. McFarlane, sorry. Quantum Physics, Depth Psychology and Beyond. And one of the reasons I really like his presentation is that he brings in the inner and outer in a quite excellent way. In a way I think otherwise would be absolutely impossible. And we are currently at page 30, and previously we've gone through that this everything, the now, covers past and now in a lower variety, the ordinary everyday now, to become the timelessness of exact time and symmetry of asymmetry. This is literally covering everything, but at the same time being infinitely small. Yes, it is definitely paradoxical. This is the first paragraph of page 30. We are now entering the sphere. To generalize from the circle and line to the higher dimensional sphere and plane, extend from the center of the original circle, shown in red, and a y-axis perpendicular to the plane of the circle. Shown in yellow, and a corresponding unit circle also shown in yellow. Thus we have duplicated the original line and circle mandala along a second perpendicular direction. The points along the y-axis are identified with its circle, just as the points along the x-axis are identified with its circle. More generally, any line in the xy plane that passes through the origin will map to a corresponding circle, just as all the lines through the origin sweep out a plane. the corresponding circles sweep out a sphere. Viewing the sphere as a globe, these circles correspond to lines of longitude. The correspondence between points in the plane and points on the sphere is a natural generalization of the lower dimensional case. Specifically, one imagines lines passing through the point at infinity, located at the south pole of the sphere. Each of these lines intersect the plane at one point and intersects the sphere at one point, matching up the points in a one-to-one correspondence. For interested readers, mathematical details of this mapping between the sphere and the plane are described below in the mathematical appendix. Since the line from the south to north pole intersects the plane at the origin, the north pole of the sphere is mapped to the origin of the plane. The south pole, however, is not mapped to a point in the plane. It corresponds to the point at infinity. Just as this point was discontinuously separated from the line in the lower dimensional case, now it is also separated from the plane. It corresponds to the point at infinity. Just as this point was discontinuously separated from the line in the lower dimensional case, now it is also separated from the plane. From the perspective of the sphere, however, this point is part of the same unified continuum as all other points. The points along the equator of the sphere map to the unit circle in the plane, which coincides with the equator, since this is where the sphere intersects with the plane. More generally, horizontal circles of the sphere, lines of latitude on the globe. I need to remove the sweater. More generally, horizontal circles on the sphere, lines of latitude on the globe, map to concentric circles of various sizes in the plane. Note that circles of latitude in the northern hemisphere map to smaller circles in the plane, while circles of latitude in the southern hemisphere map to larger circles in the plane. Symmetries of hemispheres, quadrants and levels. The points in the plane with positive values of x are mapped to the eastern hemisphere of the sphere, while the points with negative values of x are mapped to the western hemisphere. In other words, the YZ plane divides the sphere into two halves. One half that maps to the right half of the plane, and another half that maps to the left half of the plane. These two halves of the plane are divided by the y-axis. Extending the interpretation given to the circle mandala, these halves correspond to the inner and outer domains of manifestation, with the y-axis representing the distinction between the two. So you see here how involution and evolution is transferred to the circle and to the sphere, and how the sphere encompasses both, but at the very same time excludes one. With an additional dimension, the plane also can be divided into points with positive values of y and points with negative values of y. These two halves of the plane are divided by the x-axis and correspond to the two hemispheres divided by the x-z plane. These two halves can be given various interpretations. For example, they can represent the distinction between singularity and plurality, manifesting in the world of objects the primordial distinction between one and many. The two singular plural hemispheres are orthogonal to the inner-outer hemispheres, dividing the sphere into four longitudinal regions, like sections of an orange. These regions map to four quadrants of the plane, representing the four possible combinations of the two divisions. The reflection symmetry of the sphere that exchanges positive and negative values of x represents the interdependence of inner knowing and outer being, just as discussed earlier with the circle Mandala. It encompasses everything. In addition, there is now a reflection symmetry of the sphere that exchanges positive and negative values of the new dimension y. This symmetry represents the interdependence and ultimate identity of singularity with plurality. And I have to point how they also can be different. The possibility of difference in between them. The interdependence is illustrated by the fact that any plurality is composed of a collection of singulars, while any singular is part of plurality. The x and y dimensions divide the plane orthogonally, generating 4 quadrants. The points on the sphere in the upper hemisphere map to points in the plane that are contained within the unit circle. While the points in the lower hemisphere map to points in the plane that are outside the unit circle. The upper-lower distinction is interpreted as the distinction between gross and subtle. As discussed earlier in relation to the circle mandala, points on the sphere that are closer to the North Pole correspond to points in the plane that are closer to the origin. While points on the sphere that are closer to the South Pole correspond to points in the plane that are further from the origin. Thus, the gradations of manifested objects correspond to the distance from the origin, so that the gross objects correspond to the northern hemisphere, and the subtle objects correspond to the southern hemisphere. The sphere has a reflection symmetry that exchanges positive and negative values of Z, reflecting points in the upper hemisphere to points in the lower hemisphere, and vice versa. This exchanges subtle and gross realms of manifestation, and the same interpretation discussed in relation to the circle mandala applies to the sphere as well. Degrees of subtlety are mirrored by degrees of concreteness, with higher concreteness corresponding to higher subtlety. In the plane, this reflection exchanges a point at a distance r from the origin with a point at a distance 1 through r from the origin. Thus exchanging large for small and vice versa. In particular, the most concrete point at the origin is exchanged with the point at infinity, symbolizing the identity of emptiness and form. In contrast to the two longitudinal divisions of the sphere that split the plane into linear quadrants, the equatorial division of the sphere splits the plane into the inside and outside of a circle. While these divisions appear very different from the perspective of the plane, from the perspective of the sphere they are equivalent. All three divisions of the sphere split it into two hemispheres. You can think also of the Ian McGilchrist in left and right hemisphere. This symmetry helps reveal that the various types of divisions in the plane are manifestations of a single type of division of the sphere. Put another way, we see that the same maxim, as above, so below, is at work in the different dimensions. Each dimension manifests a different aspect of the primordial one/many distinction between the plane and the point at infinity. In the Z dimension, this primordial distinction manifests its aspect of formlessness form as the distinction subtle grows. In the X dimension, it manifests its aspect of subjective-objective as the distinction inner-outer, and in the Y dimension, it manifests its numerical aspect as the distinction singular-plural. The three dimensions can thus be seen as modes of representing different aspects of the primordial distinction of one/many. Unfolding its implicit meaning into explicit dimensions in different ways. The symmetry of the sphere reveals not only insights due to reflection symmetries. The sphere also has a continuous rotation symmetry about any axis. Rotation about the y-axis represents the process of involution and evolution as it dynamically transforms through the dimensions of inner and outer. Rotation about the x-axis also represents the processes of involution and evolution, but now in relation to the dimensions of singular and plural. Rotation about the z-axis dynamically transforms the dimensions of inner and outer with those of singular plural, leaving the evolutionary or involutionary level unchanged. These rotational transformations are symbols for how reality is not fixed by our distinctions and categories, but dynamically flows through them, transforming them into each other. It is interesting to note that the involutionary and evolutionary phases both have implicit and explicit aspects at each level. At the level of the transcendent, the one is explicit and the many is implicit. The difference is that the involution unfolds the implicit many from the explicit one, while evolution unfolds the implicit one from the explicit many. Both phases are needed to get a complete picture. I end 1560 here. You see here how we can get a better grip of inner and outer, but also many and singular, and that singular does not come from a part of many, or many is not an agglomeration of the ones. You need to stir free from that. Often comes to closure, cutting off, sharpness, and of course, as we mentioned earlier, in connection with Paul Livingstone and Johnston with Wittgenstein, it's a language misunderstanding. Misunderstanding the level of description with the level what is really happening. They have no connection whatsoever, and that very misunderstanding led to the classical logic, which is not a coherent system. So at the very bottom there's this grave misunderstanding, which Thomas McFarlane takes up so nicely, but at the same time being careful not to overstep his possibilities. And one pointer is always think of the line first, that it is actually derived from the circle. The circle is also derived from the sphere, And now we go into non-Euclidean geometry, and we know everything is truer but also incredibly different from how we normally perceive or misperceive them to act. Here we have sturdy ground for building a new understanding that, thanks to its more encompassing and expanding knowledge, can take into account both subject and object at every step. With no need for shutting out the subjective part or replacing it with a transcendental presence, which is the essence of the essence of the essence. Well, I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant night. Bye bye.